Hey everyone, this is the required module number 2 on legal research analysis, part of the Excellence in Legal Research program. So today we're going to be going over a system by which you can identify all of the correct information you need in order to successfully do your legal research. And the goal of legal research is obviously to identify your primary law, as well as helper resources, e.g. secondary sources that are incredibly useful so that you can ethically and competently represent your client. So issue analysis is really just asking yourself a series of questions to identify significant facts, key terms and phrases, legal issues, your jurisdiction, and also to assess your existing knowledge. So you do this essentially by asking yourself the 5 W questions: the who, what, when, why, and where. And the other thing we always want to do in this analysis is identify your key terms and phrases and expand that list by adding any synonyms, alternate phrases, legal terms of art. And to find these, you can use secondary sources in the area of law that your question is in, dictionaries, both legal and non-legal dictionaries, like Black's Law Dictionary or just a regular dictionary. When you look up a word, the definition will give you alternate terms, and then you can always use Google or Wikipedia, and generative AI is really a good tool for this type of task. So it's always important to assess your existing legal knowledge because it's really part of ABA competency rules. Rule 1.1 says that in order to adequately represent your client, you must be thorough and do sufficient preparation, right? Just because you don't have a lot of knowledge or you're not familiar with the area of law or the jurisdiction, that doesn't mean you can't be a good lawyer, because as you can see in the comment for this rule 1.1, you can always provide adequate representation in a wholly novel field or jurisdiction through necessary study. And secondary sources are the key to this necessary study. So even if you're an old hand in the topic you're representing, things do change, and secondary sources are kept up to date, and they will help you identify the pertinent information, the primary law for the particular jurisdiction or topic that you're working in. And now I know it's really easy to think that you can use a generative AI product such as Claude or ChatGPT or the AI products put out by Lexis or Westlaw in order to do this type of initial work. But the thing you have to remember that even if you're working in a closed system AI product like Lexis or Westlaw, because of the nature of the software and the coding of generative AI products, they will always create hallucinated citations or provide incorrect statements of law, particularly things like ChatGPT or Claude. Even though Claude does have a legal plugin you can use, just by the very nature of what they are, they can still create incorrect information for you. And as you are probably already aware, many lawyers have gotten into some pretty bad situations because they misused generative AI in their representation. And so sometimes that can be a slap on the wrist by the court, or it can be as severe as disbarment. So it's just so much easier and actually is a better use of your time if you just use the standard secondary sources that lawyers have been using forever, right? So It may seem like plugging in a question into Claude or Harvey or Lexis is the way to go. The fact is if you're a good lawyer, you really do have to go back through that document that it produces and check the veracity of the statements of law, the summations of cases, and all of the citations. Okay, so really just use the secondary sources that you have available to you. So how do you identify secondary sources? So to get to them in Westlaw and Lexis, you can navigate to your specific jurisdiction. So if it's a state jurisdiction or federal, you go to that tab there that's on the content page. And then once you're in that jurisdiction, you can then look for the secondary sources. Or you can start with the secondary sources content off of the content page and then narrow down to your jurisdiction or by topic. Another good resource are library research guides. So at Texas Tech, we have some research guides that will identify specific secondary sources for you. You can also use the research guides listed on other law library websites. So you could go to UT's law library and look at their research guide, because we all basically use the same secondary sources. So research guides are a great thing. Also, you can ask us, you can ask your librarians what would be a good secondary source. Okay, so let's practice this legal analysis. So I'm actually going to go back up to our questions. So what we need to do when we're looking at this hypo here is that we want to identify the significant facts. We want to identify the key terms and phrases as well as their synonyms, any legal terms of art, specific legal phrases that might be associated with the key terms that we found in the hypo. We want to identify the legal issue. We also need to identify the jurisdiction, and we need to assess our knowledge on the topic. So let's go back to the hypo here. And the hypo is, you represent Daniel and Isabella Mendoza, the owners of a 280-acre ranch called Mendoza Meadows, LLC, near Grafford, Texas. Last December, the Mendozas, by and through their company, entered into a contract with Calvin and Elsa Schmidt, by and through their company, CES Holdings, LLC, also known as CES, wherein CES agreed to buy Mendoza Meadows for a purchase price of $15 million. The parties executed an asset purchase agreement for the sale of the ranch on December 2nd, 2024. The sale was scheduled to close on December 1st, 2025, and CES was scheduled to pay a good faith earnest money deposit of $1.5 million cash on August 1st, 2025. However, CES did not pay the earnest money deposit, and it is now trying to get out of the contract completely, arguing that recent problems with runoff from the neighboring swine operation has polluted a portion of the ranch. So what you want to do is just take a minute and start going through those 5 W questions: the who, what, when, why, and where. Okay, so just take a second to do that. And we'll go on. So let's identify the answers to those questions. So the who is Mendoza Meadows, LLC. So for the purposes of this hypo, just assume that you are representing Mendoza Meadows, LLC. Now, in real life, you might be representing CES. So in that case, the answer to these next questions will differ because you're representing a different party, right? So in criminal law, right, your research is going to differ if you're representing the defendant compared to if you're the prosecutor, right? Because your issue is going to be different, right? So what is this issue? Well, from Mendoza's viewpoint, they likely want to make CES fulfill the contract, right? So they probably want to make them pay that earnest money and to go through with the contract as it is written, right? So it's a real estate contract dispute. So to take this a bit further, we have to ask ourselves, what type of law is this? And remember, in the United States, we have these two basic types of law. We have criminal law and we have civil law, right? So contract disputes are civil law, okay? And we have this subtopic within contract. It's a real estate contract, right? And the other thing to know is that we're dealing with two limited liability companies. So that might change the laws that we need to look at, as well as what case law is relevant to us, because there are different types of companies, and so the laws may differ if it's an LLC compared to a private company, right? So it's these little facts that you need to be aware of, because it can change the primary law that you need to find. And also, going back to secondary sources, now there are contract secondary sources, so treatises, practice manuals specific to contracts, but then there are also more specific secondary sources on real estate law. So the reason why we do this initial analysis, even before going into secondary sources, is that we need to identify the correct type of secondary source for our research task, right? So you could start with a contract treatise, right? But then you also really do need to go into a real estate treatise or a real estate practice manual, because it's going to have information specific to real estate transactions. So the reason why we have to ask this is that we need to know if this is current law that we're working under, or is this something that happened in the past, right? If it's happened in the past, we'd need to figure out, is there a statutes of limitations on the issue, right? So if it's past the statutes of limitation, then we might not have a case at all, right? Or you might be in a situation where you need to argue the older law. Maybe there's not a statutes of limitations on it, but your argument might be dependent on how that law was defined in the past, right? So that might take you into more historical resources, like older versions of statutes, or case law that was decided at the time that the event happened. So understanding this time component is really important in making sure you find the correct materials, okay? But in this case, it only happened last year, within the past couple of years, so we're looking at current law, okay? And we already really talked about the why. We want to enforce the completion of the contract and the payment of that earnest money. So where did it happen? So this is our jurisdiction. So our jurisdiction is Texas. It's specifically in Palo Pinto County. And the reason why knowing the county or the city is necessary in Texas is that might identify which court we're going to be going into. And then also in Texas has a separate business court that I believe, don't quote me on this, I believe it depends on the amount that's in dispute. So if it's above a certain amount, that it just automatically goes into the corporate business court. If it's below a certain amount, then it will go into the specific court, state court jurisdiction. So again, knowing all of the facts really can be important when you're figuring out which specific court you're going into, right? And then let's look at some terms and phrases. So describe what type of real estate this is. It's ranch, it's land, right? In Texas, there might be some other terminology that describes the type of ranch that Mendoza Meadows is, right? If this was about oil dispute, some type of oil rights, then it might be a ranch. It could be an oil lease, for example. So thinking of all the different terminology that is common for this jurisdiction to add to your terms and phrases list is really important. And then the what and the why, the purchase, enforcement, asset purchase, agreement, contract, have agreement there twice, contract, earnest money, all of those types of phrases. And then as you start going through the secondary sources, you'll start identifying alternate terms. Maybe there's terms of art that are used specifically in real estate law, etc. So as you find these things, add them to your list of terms and phrases. Earnest money, we already talked about that one. And then seller, buyer, purchaser, terms that describe the parties are also really important to note. So once you've done that initial analysis, it's just the first part of your research process. And the research process, remember, is a cyclical process, right? So from the initial analysis, if you know very little about the topic, the issue, the jurisdiction, then you always want to start with secondary sources, because it's going to give you the lay of the land, and it's going to identify like the basic primary cases, statutes, and regulations that you need to be aware of, right? And from the secondary sources, then you can start going into your more in-depth primary law research. So looking for all of the required statutes, all of the case law that you need in order to make your argument, etc. And then always you need to review and double check those resources. So that's why we use Westlaw and Lexis, because they have the citator function. And when you're in a case or a statute in Westlaw or Lexis, it's going to tell you through the flag system that if there's something going on with it, if a part of the case has been overturned, or if there's pending legislation that might change the statute that you're looking at, etc. And then you also want to go back and compare what you found with that initial analysis. Are you completely answering the question that you identified, the issue that you identified? And if you haven't, then you're basically going to go through the process again. And it's just a cyclical process that you'll know when you're pretty much done, when you've gone back through and you've done your double checking and you're finding the same things. Basically, you're repeatedly seeing the same cases in all the secondary sources that you consult, etc. So that's kind of how you know when to stop. So if you have questions about that, please do not hesitate to get in touch with me. You can always send me an email at this email address, and I will be sure to respond to you. You can also just go on our reference chat, or call the reference desk, or send an email to the reference desk. All of that information is available on the Law Library's website. We're always happy to help you. So when you go to do the assessment for this module, it's going to ask you to find materials related to a hypo, and you'll successfully find those hypos if you do that initial analysis, if you go through all of the questions on the initial analysis, because the correct answers really do depend on you doing the initial analysis correctly. So that's how you successfully complete the assignment for this. So I hope this was helpful to you. And again, don't ever hesitate to ask for help from me or from the other reference librarians. We literally get paid to help you. So thanks a lot for watching, and good luck.